Okay, so my name is Angharad. I'm a trainee genetic counsellor within the Welsh service. Um, I've also just completed my master's in genetic and genomic counselling, and this was a research project that I undertook in my third year. This is some feedback for the project that I did. So the title of the project was Life with Vascular Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, What are the effects on partner relationships and family planning? So as a brief overview then, in this session I'll be covering a background, aims of the project, methods, the results, and then a bit of a summary. So at the beginning of the project, I carried out a literature review, and this was really to understand the current research that was available relating to vEDS and relationships and to identify gaps in the current published evidence. These were the gaps that I identified and then built upon in my research. So I found that there was limited published evidence on the psychosocial impact of a vEDS diagnosis, and there was very little insight into how vEDS affects partner relationships, including how the diagnosis affects family planning, reproductive choices, and intimacy within relationships. So the overall aim of my project was to explore the effects of living with a life-limiting condition on instigating and maintaining relationships and the approach to planning the future and potentially starting a family. Within this overall aim, I had some key objectives, which included exploring attitudes and around relationships when living with a life-threatening diagnosis, to explore expectations of patients towards their partner or potential partners, and then to explore opinions and feelings around family planning when living with a life-threatening condition that can also be inherited. This is a brief overview of my methodology. So I chose a qualitative approach, and this was partly due to the sensitive nature of the topics within this study, for example, discussing family planning. And a qualitative approach can be beneficial when existing literature is limited, as it allows the opportunity to capture the different viewpoints and experiences. I chose a semi-structured approach to my interviews, and this was to encourage flexibility, and it allowed elaboration for both me as the interviewer, but then also for my participants as well. And I wanted to give participants the space to discuss the points that they felt were most important to the topic, aside from my questions, really. We interviewed over Zoom, and there was benefits to this in that participants could engage with interviews in a safe and private space, which again I felt was important for discussing these sensitive topics. And it also prevented any geographical barriers, as Annabelle's Challenge does welcome members from all over the UK. Thematic analysis was then chosen for the benefits of being able to be flexible in the approach to my analysis and the data, and the ability to examine the different perspectives and thoughts of my participants. I've also included my inclusion and exclusion criteria on this slide here as well. So again, just a quick overview of how it worked then. So I placed a recruitment advert on the website of Annabelle's Challenge. This was written with Annabelle's Challenge, and they had a box on there to submit an email address to Annabelle's Challenge if interested in participating. These email addresses of interested members were then shared with me via a password-protected worksheet, and I contacted them via email with the participant information sheet and consent form to invite them to take part. I had about 13 members show interest initially in participating, but only 6 consent forms were returned. Part of my methods was to send one reminder email to anyone who had shown interest, and I received a further 2 consent forms. So in total, I arranged and completed 8 interviews. These interviews, as I said, were carried out on Zoom, and then I manually transcribed and coded these and conducted the thematic analysis on the codes. This table shows some key information about my participants. As you can see, the 8 interviews are carried out with a mean length of 42 minutes. My participants were mostly female. I had 6 females to 2 males. They were mostly in the 25 to 39 age bracket, but there were a few in 40 to 59. There was a range of ages at diagnosis and the presence of family history, but all my participants were currently in a relationship, though some were not in a relationship at the time of their diagnosis. There was also a mix of participants with children and those without. I've highlighted on this slide that of those who had children, one adopted her child because of her diagnosis, another went through pre-implantation genetic testing or PGT in order to have their child, and another 2 participants were diagnosed during their pregnancy. So the thematic analysis of my data yielded a total of 40 codes, which were then subsequently grouped into 3 overarching themes with multiple sub-themes within each overarching theme. The 3 themes that I've got on this slide here are what happens next, facing fear together, and necessary change. And I'll go through these in more detail. So the first overarching theme is what happens next, which I further split into living with uncertainty, anxiety, and limited time. A dominant theme throughout the interviews was how unpredictable and variable the nature of the condition is, and how this introduced difficulty and anxiety for the affected individual, but also for their partner. Previous experiences of a severe clinical event only increase the anxiety around the unpredictability of vEDS and how the symptoms may manifest in the future. These discussions developed into how they live with uncertainty and anxiety regarding their health, what the future may hold for them, both as an individual and as a couple, and then the sentiment of living on borrowed time. So here are some of the key quotes. I'll just let you read as I go through things. And I feel that these illustrate some of the feelings and experiences behind the theme. So learning to live with uncertainty was a key feeling that arose through most of the interviews, particularly the difficulty of living a normal life and trying to make plans for the future when there is a risk of having a severe clinical event that's running underneath it all. These sentiments were discussed in all three of the quotes on the slide and reflected on the different impacts that this has had on their lives. This fed into the feelings of anxiety that was common among all the participants, but was also mentioned in reference to their partner's worries as well and the effect that the condition has had on their well-being too. Participants also reported more frequent discussions around the future with their partner and an urgency to achieve their life goals, which was associated with these feelings of living on borrowed time. This awareness appeared to infiltrate many aspects of the participants' lives, including how to plan for the future in practical ways, but then also to enable them to make the most of their time together. There seemed to be an internal struggle of trying to live in the moment and enjoying the time together that they have, but also the need to be cautious and not to encourage the possibility of having a severe medical event. The balancing act was reflected on by many of the participants in my study as something that they were attempting to navigate as individuals, but then also within their couple relationship as a whole. Some reflected that they may have been choosing to minimize their lives through restriction as directed by their healthcare teams, but it was possible that they may never actually experience a severe clinical event. Somewhat unsurprisingly, those who seemed the most conflicted around this balance and questioned whether this restriction was necessary had not actually experienced any serious medical issues associated with their condition so far. So the second overarching theme is Fate and Fear Together. And again, this was split into three sub-themes of advocacy, partner education, and ways to cope. This theme is centered around the importance of supporting each other within the relationship during hardship and times of uncertainty. Support was both emotional and practical, and participants highlighted the need for both partners within the relationship to give and receive support. This was a topic that arose through all the interviews in one way or another as a key dynamic within their relationship since receiving their diagnosis. Advocacy was a recurring issue, and the idea of partner advocacy was intrinsically linked to how well informed their partner was on the medical issues that are associated with vEDS. Better informed partners would discuss more often as being advocates already, or they felt confident in their ability to advocate for them if needed. Coping styles within relationships did vary. Some discussed using humor, others took a more fatalistic approach, whereas some chose to remain positive. In some cases, these approaches seem to be shared by both partners within the relationship, while for others, the partners appeared to be taking opposite approaches. For example, one partner choosing complete avoidance. Again, I've included some key quotes for this theme. As I said, advocacy within the relationship was often referenced by participants in one of two ways, either that they felt confident in their partner's ability to advocate for them if needed, or that they did not think that their partner could advocate for them. This was talked about most commonly in reference to whether they felt their partner could advocate if they could not do it for themselves. For example, in this case, in the circumstance where they've had a severe clinical event. This linked with participants' experiences of their partner's understanding of vEDS. Half of the participants described that their partners have chosen to educate themselves around the medical issues associated, while the others have chosen to avoid medical information or doing any of their own research. Some participants felt that they thought this could be a coping or a defense mechanism for their partner, and most participants respected and/or understood this point of view. And in fact, some participants highlighted the lack of support that is available for partners of people who are affected by vEDS. So the final overarching theme is necessary change. This theme I split into four sub-themes, which are informed family planning, changing roles, acts of rebellion, and adjusting lifestyle. This theme is centered around a need for change in various aspects of their lives following their diagnosis, but also, in some cases, a refusal to accept or implement change. All participants in this study discussed the various changes that they have made as a result of their diagnosis, but the degree of change varied among the participant group, with examples including avoidance of activities that might raise their heart rate, for example, going to a theme park, to then things like choosing not to have children if affected by vEDS, making practical financial choices which would protect each other in the event of an early retirement or in the event of someone's death, and abandoning plans for travel to far-flung destinations where healthcare may not be as easily accessed. Across all of the interviews, my participants discussed how their diagnosis affected their plans for having a family. Within this group of participants, one had chosen to adopt as a direct result of having their diagnosis, while another had chosen to pursue their pre-implantation genetic testing for conception. Two were given their diagnosis during pregnancy and had chosen not to have any more children after this, and three had chosen not to have children at all. Understandably, opinions differed on the best way forward for themselves as individuals, but then also as a couple and as a family unit as a whole. Another shared experience for most participants was the need for change within the usual household roles that usually exist within the relationship since they had the diagnosis. These changes often occurred as a result of the associated symptoms of vEDS, such as fatigue, but also to observe the lifestyle advice that is given following diagnosis by healthcare professionals. I found an interesting dichotomy appeared in some of the interview transcripts that despite clear advice given by healthcare professionals regarding necessary changes, there was also a shared sentiment of pushing against this change and in some cases, just active rebellion. You'll see from the quotes on this slide that participants highlighted that any changes to their lifestyle are undeniably linked to the changes in their lifestyle of their partner and their relationship as a whole. In addition to the suggested lifestyle changes and then practical changes to finances and financial planning, participants also highlighted that changes occur within their relationships and not always expected or agreed upon. For example, the evolution of their romantic partner into a caregiver or the primary contributor to the household, either through income or participation in usual household responsibilities, which include things like childcare, doing household chores, and then things like preparation of meals as well. This further emphasized the rippling impacts of the diagnosis from just one individual. The effects are not only felt by those directly at risk, but also those who are not personally at risk, but are close to the person who is. This did lead to some discussion around guilt and frustration for their partner where changes have had to be made, though the idea of discontent was not discussed explicitly by this group. One of the quotes here really illustrates the acts of rebellion and a reluctance to implement change, in that one participant has decided not to let their vEDS diagnosis prevent them from skiing, but they did reflect that others with the condition may disagree with this. A more sensitive change that was discussed by many of the participants was how their diagnosis has affected plans for having a family. Apart from one participant who had had children long before they had their diagnosis, the other participants in the study discussed how their diagnosis has affected their outlook on the best way to navigate this dilemma. This included topics such as interest in or having utilized prenatal genetic testing, concern of recurrence risk, and the impact of pregnancy and or parenting on their health, but also the decision to have or not to have more children, the reflection on how the diagnosis is made, the decision making around reproduction just more deliberate in general. You can see from one of the quotes here that one participant reflected that they attribute their choice to adopt solely on their diagnosis. So in summary, the participants in the study have contributed their individual insights and experiences into the different ways that their diagnosis of vEDS has impacted on their partner relationships and also on their plans for the future. Though their individual circumstances were unique, there were many shared concerns and observations across my interviews. On the whole, though, the relationships of those living with a diagnosis with vEDS are faced with challenges. The participants didn't actually suggest that this has had an overall negative impact on their partner relationships. Rather, it seemed that their perception of the impacts on the relationship varied depending on what aspects were being discussed at the time. Adjustments to lifestyle and to roles within the relationship seem to be widely accepted as necessary following diagnosis, and all participants did discuss the way that they felt supported and the ways that they have learned to cope as a couple. For most participants, the main way in which their relationship has been impacted was related to their plans for having a family, and where changes to their plans or sacrifices have been made were described as the most challenging issue that couples faced. An interesting point to arise as part of this research was the perceived need for support for the unaffected partner too. Participants discussed the impact on their partner's well-being and mental health and how this can affect their relationship as a whole. We did have some discussion around the difference between support for partners in a vEDS relationship versus a more well-known health problem such as cancer or heart disease. And not only does this raise an important point for healthcare professionals involved with these families, but not only is it beneficial to the patient to consider how better to support the whole family unit, but this could also represent an additional emotional burden for those who have been diagnosed with vEDS to have to contend with. It's important to remember that though all relationships tackle an amount of uncertainty, as no one can predict the future, a life-limiting diagnosis can add additional instability and can introduce additional strain to these relationships as a result. So finally, just some reflections that I made and some possible future directions that I thought of when I was writing this up. So at the time of designing the project, I had only really thought about the perspective of the person with vEDS, and it really didn't occur to me to involve partners during recruitment. But in retrospect, I can now see that offering the opportunity to interview the couples together or separately would have provided some additional enrichment to the data that I collected. So following the analysis of the interview transcripts, it became clear that there are impacts on the partners of those with vEDS, but all the accounts that I have collected are the opinions and the observations of the affected individuals. So though this is still very valuable and offers insight that has not previously been explored, the data I feel would have been strengthened by also understanding the first-hand experience of the unaffected partner and seeing how the two perceptions of the condition have affected their relationships from the perspective of both sides. The other point that I was thinking about when I wrote this up is that we really didn't touch on the impact of intimacy on vEDS, or vEDS on intimacy, sorry. The original conception of the project came from a conversation with a patient who has vEDS, who felt that intimacy and relationships were important aspects of their experience since they received their diagnosis. But these are issues that are not routinely discussed. So this was initially the direction I wanted to take, but during the study design, after discussion with supervisors and being on a tight time limit, it was decided this may put off potential participants, and so any explicit references to intimacy were removed. But I did leave an open question at the end of the interview in the hope that participants would share anything else that they felt was important. In the end, only one participant chose to discuss issues associated with intimacy within the relationship, but they also did reflect that it would be helpful for them to know if they were the only one and if they had hoped that others may discuss it. As others didn't bring the issue of intimacy up to me, then it's hard for me now to know what the impact is and whether this is an issue for many other people living with vEDS or if it is just a small number of cases. But even if this is an issue that only affects a small number of people, it would still be very useful to capture their perspectives for the benefit of the wider community. I do regret not asking the questions specific to intimacy and taking the opportunity to explore this further as part of the project. If I had the time to approach it again, I would have chosen to include it in as a section of questions, but I would have made it clear to prospective participants that this was one of the aims of the study so that they knew. So just some final thank yous then. I would really like to take the opportunity to thank the team at Annabelle's Challenge for all their support in setting the study up and helping me recruit participants. A big thank you to everyone who participated in the study for sharing their time and their views with me. I'm so grateful for your input, and there wouldn't be a research project without you. And then lastly, a big thank you to the GC team at the Sheffield EDS Genetic Service. They provided so much help and insight when I was starting this project. So again, really grateful for all of your help. And that's it.